loud voice. Brilliant. Right. A warm welcome, everybody, to the fourth in our series on STA Tools. And I would love to introduce Jo Derry Hall, who has been with us now for over a year, working hard on the STA Volunteer app, and is going to take us through an introduction to TypeScript. Over to you, Jo.
Cool, thanks. Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to share my screen and let's check first that's working. So can you now see big yellow and blue screen that says introduction to TypeScript? Lovely. Cool. And then I'm just going to try flicking to show you some code quickly. Don't worry about kind of getting it, but can you read that? Is that readable? Does it need to be a bit bigger? Okay, great. Lovely. Cool. Okay, I'm going to crack on. So I should say before I say anything else, I'm going to be looking over at my other screen over here. So you're probably going to see kind of the side of my face on it. So apologies for that. It also means if you're sitting there kind of looking confused or bored or waving your hands, I might not see any of that. There'll be a time for kind of questions at the end. But if I just said something and you're absolutely confused about what it was, or you kind of need to dive into something, then do like unmute and shout and ask a question. What I'm also going to do before I go any further is just drop into the chat. This is a link to the slides, and you don't need this while we're going through it. You can just watch on screen. But if for afterwards you want that, you've got it. You should also hopefully see that up on the screen as well. Just on that first slide, and it's also got the GitHub repo where there's a bit of code. Again, you might not need that, but just so you kind of got it all if you want to kind of go away and play later on. So yeah, Joanna's kind of introduced me, so maybe I don't need to do this. Basically, I'm a freelance developer. Is my kind of most of my day job, and yeah, volunteer with the STA. So I'm gonna obviously be talking about TypeScript. I use it kind of most days. So this is what I'm going to try and do is make this quite practical, not too much theory, although just a little bit of that. But I should say I'm not an expert. I use it. I find things I love about it. I've kind of had to battle and Google Stack Overflow, whatever else, just like you would. But hopefully that's helpful. But what I should say is, I guess everything I'm going to tell you is kind of, hopefully it's correct, but it's from a kind of personal perspective of me using it. There's also obviously loads of other kind of courses and tutorials and things online. So, go wild with those as well, for sure. What we're going to cover, so why use TypeScript, a little bit about what it is, how to get set up if you wanted to start like a project using TypeScript. And then what I'm going to try and focus on most of the time on is kind of some practical stuff. So actually looking at some code, how do we use it, like real examples. If we've got time, I might touch on just a few kind of headaches that I experienced, particularly in the kind of early stages. So if I can save you some pain, I will. I'll try to do that. And then a time, yeah, for questions at the end. So do be thinking as we go through if there's things you want to know more about, or you want to go back to maybe and have another look at. All of that is great. Or yeah, that will be really good. And I'll try to answer if I can, and if I can't, then I'll try and be honest about that too. I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is just to say there is some code that I'll be talking through. That's where the repo is. There's some instructions on the README in the repo, which kind of tells you how to get started with it, and how to use it. And then a couple of things about useful kind of VS Code extensions. But I'm not going to kind of dwell on that, but that's there if you want to go back to it later on. So I'm going to try and kind of tell you first of all a little bit about kind of what TypeScript is and why I find it helpful. The way I kind of think about it is JavaScript, which is your picture on the left, like in the sense of something lovely and free and easy. You can just start using it. There's lots of things you can do that you can kind of get away with. So and so in a sense, the kind of barriers to getting started, I would say, are lower. TypeScript, I almost feel it's like TypeScript is like JavaScript, but it kind of grew up and got a job. So as we'll see, TypeScript, it's stricter than JavaScript, and sometimes that will kind of drive you a little bit mad, maybe. But mostly that helps, I find, with like makes your code cleaner, clearer, and stabler as well. Whereas JavaScript is kind of freer and easier, but there's more likely to be bugs and things that can go wrong in your code. So yeah, that's kind of one way that I think about it. So we'll get into what it is in a minute, but first of all, kind of why are we here, kind of why are we even interested in this? So the reason for using TypeScript is you have to be strict about the data types you're using. Is something an array? Is it an object? What is in that object, and what do we expect not to be there? So you have to be kind of very strict in a way that, and we'll get into this with examples, JavaScript just kind of doesn't care about. And actually, sorry, what I meant to do on the previous slide was just actually switch and show you a couple of examples. So just to kind of kick this off. So this is just a bit of JavaScript here. So if I've got a variable called people here, I can start off. I can make that variable a string, so that people might be a string. So there's a group of volunteers. I could change it to a number if I want to. I could change it to an array of people's names. I can make it an object. Maybe there's different roles. If these are like volunteers on an STA project, maybe there's a researcher, a designer, tester. Maybe there aren't any people, so I'll kind of make it false. And there's instructions in the README about how to do this. If I run that code, just see what it says. So that the type of that variable people, at the beginning of the code, it's a string, then it's a number, then it's an array, then it's an object, then it's a Boolean, which is like a true, false. And JavaScript will let us do all of those things and more. So we can kind of mess around it to our heart's content. If I show you a similar thing in TypeScript, and do shout if you kind of can't see, if the text isn't big enough on the code, I can bump it up a bit. But if we have a similar variable, some people, so we make it a string at the beginning. If I try and uncomment that code and make it a number, then immediately my code editor is going to kind of scream at me this horrible red line and say you can't do that, and that's because it's a string and you shouldn't be doing it. So maybe it's an array. I want it to be, oh no, I've forgotten it's actually a string. This is obviously a really trivial example, and we'll come on to kind of some more kind of real worldy ones. But this is kind of the TypeScript approach, that we'll see more of, which is it's very strict. At every point, it's a string or it's an array or it's like a Boolean or whatever, and you kind of can't mess around it in the same way that we could do when we were looking at it in JavaScript. I'm just going to show you another example. Now, you look at that code and you might be thinking, hang on, what does that function do? Don't worry about all the kind of detail of what's in here. This is literally, I've pretty much copied and pasted this from, this is a real world function from the volunteer app project that some of us are working on. And if I ask kind of two questions, so are these parameters that are passed into this function, what is the type of each one? Table name, I don't know, maybe table name might be a string, perhaps, not sure. Include ID, don't know. Linked fields, well, I'm really not sure about that. So don't know. What type of thing does this function return? So I could probably go looking down here. Okay, there's a couple of return statements. So eventually I might be able to kind of work it out. It's not really clear. Obviously, we could add like some docs above here, some kind of hints about what it should be in JavaScript. But in JavaScript, kind of by default, you get functions like this, where particularly as things get more complicated, you're like, okay, what is this data going in, and what is the data I'm getting out of this function? I'm not sure. If I show you a similar example in TypeScript, so I've taken out some of the code here just to kind of simplify things. And you don't need to worry about the detail of this, but immediately, as I look at how a function is defined in TypeScript, okay, table name, that is a string. Okay, include ID, that's a Boolean, so that's going to be true or false. You might be wondering quite what's going on here, the syntax, linked fields. Okay, that's something to do with this linked field. Oh, right, that's defined here. We're going to be coming back to kind of looking at quite all the things that are going on here, but just as a kind of starting point, just the way these two things look different in TypeScript and JavaScript is in TypeScript, you're being much clearer about kind of what type of data everything is. So we'll come on to more of what this all means, but that's a bit of code to start us off. So yeah, being strict about kind of data types. It's also, it will avoid problems later. I don't think you'll get a full sense of this in the kind of all the examples we're looking at today, because we're going to kind of stick quite simple. But the idea of TypeScript is your code editor is trying to kind of keep you strict about how you're using variables, what types they are, what types functions are returning, and that kind of thing, so that when your code actually runs later, might be in a browser and you're not there to see it go wrong for a user, or it might be on the server, that you're kind of essentially avoiding problems like down the line by getting it right, by things being stricter when you actually code. It makes you clearer about all of that. You have to be. And I find one of the things I really find, and if we have time, we'll look at this, when you're particularly, so when I was showing you like some of those examples there with, you know, people, okay, so this is a really trivial example. It's a string or it's a number or whatever. In the real world, as I'm sure we'll find, often you might be dealing with like an array of objects that have got nested objects and arrays. So it's when you're getting into kind of complexity, that's one of the ways that I find TypeScript just makes life kind of clearer and easier. And I think another advantage, I think it's particularly useful for kind of bigger or more complex projects as well, where you might be reusing certain types of data. Folks here are working on the volunteer app. There are things like volunteer projects, and we'll use those kind of again and again, or events. And so you can define them once in TypeScript and then kind of reuse data structures again and again, which we can't do so easily in JavaScript. And I think, certainly for me, I feel I've become a better developer by using it, because it's kind of, it imposes kind of more rules, I suppose, on what you're doing. There are some downsides, as there is with all things. Probably one of the biggest ones is like, it's another thing to learn. So if you're like, oh, I'm just getting to the stage of learning kind of the things that I need in JavaScript, you're like, oh, it's like a whole other layer on top. So, you know, we've all felt that pain, right? We know there are things we should learn or be good to do, but you know, there is a learning curve for sure. And it can be that the initial development can kind of take a bit longer, because you have to do all these things like getting your data structures kind of clear and so on. JavaScript, in a sense, you can just get going a bit quicker. But I would say probably overall, because you tend to avoid bugs more, that actually I would say potentially you save time in the long run. So particularly if there's a project that is, you know, is kind of long running or is bigger. But yeah, sometimes there is that kind of bit of a hump, a little bit more to do at the beginning. And yeah, it can be frustrating. So, you know, as with like learning new languages and things, you might be tearing your hair out at times. So yeah, we'll come on to maybe a little bit of that later on. But, you know, there are some downsides, but so this is the Stack Overflow developer survey. There's lots of useful stuff in there. If you're interested, there's a link on the slide. This is a graph of basically what people said was there. So on the left, the blue is the number of people who said they loved the language, and the number of, on the right, and the purple is the number of people said they kind of dreaded using it. And so essentially the ones at the top are the kind of most loved languages, and TypeScript is kind of near the top. And JavaScript, there are more. I had to crop this in the slide. It's not that JavaScript is the most hated language in the world. There are more below that, but it's definitely something I found. The more you use it, the more you kind of get into it. Right, that's a bit of kind of background. Just a tiny bit of theory about, I guess, about what TypeScript is. Technically, if this means anything to you, it's a superset of JavaScript. So it's JavaScript plus. So anything that you, more or less, anything that you can write in JavaScript, you can also write in TypeScript. And then TypeScript kind of adds on some more things. This is not an entirely new language. This is like taking what you know about JavaScript and doing some more things, learning some more things that you can do. But it works slightly differently to JavaScript in that TypeScript itself doesn't run in your browser, and it doesn't run straight if you're on like a Node.js server. TypeScript itself doesn't run. There's a step in between where you use a TypeScript compiler, and that basically takes your TypeScript code, and it turns it into JavaScript, which can run. I'm just going to show you very quickly on this this project that I'm using as an example. So in the source folder, we've got the kind of files that I've been writing. So the .ts, the TypeScript ones, and then I'm using this. I'm using a compiler that's running in my terminal, and then that translates it into JavaScript. Now, when you look at, if you ever look at any of these files, particularly when they get a bit more complicated, they kind of look, they can look horrible, like lots of stuff going on. Yeah, look at that one. And you're like, what is all of this? The great news is, and it's normally in a lib folder, is where your compiled JavaScript goes. You don't ever need to look at that. In fact, you should never touch those kind of finished files. So you can just ignore that, but just to tell you that's where it is, that's the actual code that will run. And that's all I'm going to kind of say about that. If you're used to using anything like Gulp or Webpack or React, where it's kind of compiling code to run, then you're already compiling your code. But it's just, yeah, it's a step if you're using TypeScript that will happen. I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you're like, okay, how do I get started and actually set something up? If you're using React, that's a link to official docs for using setting up with TypeScript. I haven't tried these, but they look like kind of useful tutorials about how to Gulp or Webpack or Node.js server. If you're using some other kind of framework, you can Google for that as well. You can also convert existing projects. Haven't done very much. I've done it in 1 or 2 React projects. It took a bit of work, but it is possible. So yeah, so I don't want to dwell on those things. What I want to do now is basically take you through a bit of kind of using it in practice, if that's okay. So I'm actually going to look at some more kind of real world examples. Cool. So I'm just going to hide that. So I've shown you a couple of these already. So I'm going to start kind of basic, and I hope this isn't kind of too kind of slow for you, but I thought I'd kind of just start at the beginning of things, just very simple, and then we can kind of look at some more complex examples, depending on how much time we have. So in JavaScript, you sometimes have to think about kind of what type something is. In TypeScript, yeah, everything has a type is the kind of thing. So sometimes TypeScript just works out what type something is from how you use it. So if I initialize this variable, it's called some text1, and then I kind of set it to a bit of text, blah, blah, text here. So this is really helpful if you're using VS Code. If you just hover your mouse over any variable, it will tell you in TypeScript kind of what type it is. Okay, so TypeScript knows it's a string here, that bit in green. Okay, so we didn't have to tell it that it was a string, but because obviously that's what we're doing. And the same would be true if I said let something else equal false. It would probably know. Yeah, there you go. So it knows it's a Boolean. We don't have to kind of do anything else to tell it that. But you can also explicitly set a type as well. So you've got this. There's a couple of different syntaxes, and this is where TypeScript starts to depart from JavaScript. Like you wouldn't write this in JavaScript, but in JavaScript, what you might write is, I'm just going to hide that one for a second. In JavaScript, you might write const some text equals blah blah 2, or you might be used to using var, although we shouldn't really use that these days, but const some text equals 2, or let some text 2 equals blah blah 2. What you do in TypeScript instead, or you can do, is to tell TypeScript that the type of this is a string in this case, or whatever you want it to be, is you just do colon and then the type that you want it to be. Okay, so that could be a Boolean, could be a number. We'll come on to looking at kind of things like arrays and objects. So that's one way you can do it. That's one syntax. So the other syntax you can do does exactly the same thing. It's just a different way of doing it. So it's just preferences. I tend to use the second one of these, but it's totally up to you. Is you can do, so some text 3 in this case equals and then string. Then you do as string. So instead of doing colon string straight after the variable name, you do as string here. So just another way of doing it. And you might be thinking at this point, this feels kind of pointless. Why are we bothering to tell TypeScript this thing is a string? You know, when we found this example of it, it already knows. One reason you might do it is so that it's clearer. So if you come back to this code 6 months later and you're kind of trying to work out what it all does, sometimes that's useful. but it can also be useful if things like maybe you've got a variable. So I just call it something here. And at this point in the code, there might be all sorts of things going on down here, which we haven't done yet, right? So loads of code below, and we're initializing a variable. We can set the type already. In fact, TypeScript will make us set the type. You can't just do this. Can we? Oh, no, you can. Sorry, you can do it. I'll come on to why you shouldn't. You can do it. In which case TypeScript will kind of let it be anything, but then you're basically kind of avoiding all the use of TypeScript. But basically we can initialize it early on. So when you've got, you might have 30 lines of code down here in your function, we know straight away what this thing is meant to be, what type of thing it's meant to be. And again, you might be looking at this and going, well, hang on, this isn't very, this is also simple, why are we bothering? As things get more complicated, all of this gets more useful. That's what I'd say for now. Sorry, that is my screen break telling me to stop. I don't know if you saw that. So sorry if that's popped up for you. So yeah, so that's how we're starting. So that's how we set a type, is using those different kinds of syntax. So that's, yeah, kind of everything has a type. So if we start looking at a couple of other examples, so we've looked at strings and numbers so far. If you want to define something as an array, so you can just do this here. So I can just say my array is an array. Now, so you have this, you do have a type in TypeScript called any, and there's also another one called unknown, and they will kind of let you make your variable into anything. But that's basically, you're essentially kind of losing all the benefits really of TypeScript at that point. So you shouldn't really do it. So what's better is here. So if you want to define something as an array of something, so if team is an array of strings, then we would define it as a string. And so you do array with your square brackets, and then you say before that, you say what is it an array of? So in this case, it's an array of strings. And then what happens, so where this starts to get a bit more useful, okay, so I can push like a name, okay, because that's like a string to it. But if I try to push a number to it, or if I try to push a Boolean to it, TypeScript will complain. You'll get this kind of screaming red line. If we were doing this in JavaScript, it wouldn't. I could just create an array and just push all sorts of things to it. And so it's kind of helping me avoid kind of bad practice, helping me avoid making mistakes like that. Similarly here, so this is an array of numbers, so I can push a number to that array. But if I try to push a string to it, again, I'm going to get an error. So it's kind of, again, it's kind of helping me to basically not make mistakes and to keep this, okay, this team age is right. This should always be, only be numbers in this array. So that's what that's doing. So that's a little bit on arrays. So going to start to get like a tiny bit more complicated here. So there's something in TypeScript called unions. So union is really useful if you've got a variable that it could be one type of thing, or it could be another type of thing, and maybe a third or a fourth possibility, or a fifth, whatever, however many. So for example, let's say you are writing some code for something that's getting some data from a form that's been filled out by a user, and maybe they filled in that postcode, so it's giving you a string, but maybe it isn't, or whatever data source you're getting this this variable from, postcode, because we're kind of we get data in from all sorts of places. So it might be a string, they might fill out the postcode, or maybe what you're getting back is undefined, which is a kind of another type, which basically says there's not filled in. You can also use null is another possibility, and then so where this starts to get useful, so I use this all the time. If you're doing things like querying databases or like external APIs, sometimes you'll get back a bit of data and sometimes you won't, maybe because something went wrong. If there's an error, you might get like an undefined, or you might get like an error object or something. So if I try to say, okay, what's the length of this postcode, then my code editor will say, hang on, you haven't thought about something here. So if my postcode, if it could be a string, so it could be filled in, right? So if I'd filled it out and it was that was my postcode. Then it would have the length. It would be, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters long. So I could do that. I could check my postcode is the right length. But this postcode could be undefined. So this is another way that TypeScript can kind of help you, is it's kind of getting you to think whenever you're dealing with something, okay, what type of thing is it? Okay, so it could be undefined. In that case, I need to write my code that will check. So you can use this. I don't know if you're familiar with the syntax. This will basically check, is it defined first? Or, you know, we could do this here. So this might be quite helpful. So we can say, is there a postcode? So that would say, is it, if it is a string, then it will tell us the length of it, or it can tell us that there's no postcode set if there isn't. And so it's kind of getting us to think about, kind of what might actually be in that data that's coming through to you, and kind of what are the things, what are your kind of plan Bs if you know, if there wasn't any data in it, or what if it's a different type of thing. So it's really helpful for kind of thinking about, yeah, kind of thinking about the different possibilities of what something might come in. Now, obviously, you've got to do the work to think about, you know, what type should I define that as in the first place, but that's definitely where it's useful. You can also do things like, so I don't know, this might not be the best example, but maybe there's a form where you ask people their name, and obviously, you know, if you built a good web form, it would probably only let you put in a number. But what if someone yeah, they should have written 35 and they actually wrote 35? Then you can basically allow for that. So, okay, that could be a possibility. And then you can then deal with it. Okay, if it's a string, we'll do something. And if it's a number, we'll do something else. It's kind of way of dealing with that. Union is also quite good if you've got a set number of choices. So, for example, let's say you can pick a programming language. So, you know, maybe there's like a volunteer project and we need a programming language for it. Now, it might be that we could allow like any possible value. We could allow anything in that, but it's quite useful if you wanted to have like a fixed, like a set number of things, you can do this. So again, it's a similar, so I haven't really talked about the kind of syntax here, but hopefully it's straightforward. So you do, so instead of that, so when we're kind of defining the type, you can basically use kind of any arbitrary values you want, or you can use these kind of set types, like things like string or number, and then you use like a single pipe. So, you know, if you're used to doing like or in TypeScript, in JavaScript, you use like a double. So you just use a single one, and then you put it between them, and you can have kind of as many as you like there. And you can also set it as a type itself. So if you want to reuse that, so because we might have a choice of programming language at various places in our project, you can also create it as a type. So this is a slightly different syntax. So the syntax here. So this is a bit different to what we've seen before. So we're not actually on this line here, 21, we're not initializing a variable, but we're saying, okay, here's a type. And normally the kind of convention is you have to start with a capital letter. And then in this case, it equals, and then it's the same thing. So then what we can then do is we can reuse it. So if we're going to use it with a variable like best language, then we can tell TypeScript that it's one of this, that it's a programming language type. So what that means is if I tried to do, let's say I tried to do, you know, Java, I want to put that as a programming language, then TypeScript will kind of tell us, no, you can't do that. So it's kind of, all of this stuff is about essentially trying to stop us, trying to kind of us set rules for what data is acceptable, and then you're kind of picking up lots of these things that could go wrong at the point of actually coding it in your code editor. So yeah, and then, you know, we could reuse that programming language type again and again. So, you know, what's the first language I learned? You know, if we say that's a programming language, then so I might want to say something else, but it gives me, so okay, so I've got these kind of choices. And also that's like another nice thing that your code editor will do. It will then kind of just give you the choices. So there's no more kind of, you're misspelling it because you didn't quite remember how we defined it. Did we put a capital letter or not? It will just give you those options kind of straight away. So yeah, so all of those things, it's quite useful. You can kind of reuse that again and again. Cool. So I've got a few more kind of examples that I wanted to show you. I might just stop there kind of quickly. Is everyone kind of following along okay? Is it making some sense? Has anyone got any kind of burning questions before I keep going? Great. I'm going to take silence as assent. If you are struggling at any point, or if it's not making sense, yeah, like I say, do shout. Cool. So might look at kind of a little look at functions now. So I know I touched on one in kind of one of the earlier examples. So one of the things that's different between TypeScript and JavaScript is that you normally you define the return value of your function. So kind of what are you going to get back from your function? So in JavaScript, we could write things like, and I'm using the kind of arrow syntax, but the same would be true if we did like my function too. So in JavaScript, yeah, you might often write things like this, right? So we'll do some stuff, and then at some point we will return something, right? As I showed you, we kind of looked at that example earlier. With JavaScript, we can write functions like this, but unless we put, obviously we can put some docs, which will kind of help, but JavaScript kind of out of the box, it doesn't tell us what we're getting back, and particularly when you've got a kind of complex, I mean, obviously you might write functions which are more complex than this. It's not obvious kind of what you're getting back, and we can't kind of make sure that that we're not like make sure of what we're getting back, and get our code editor to kind of help us enforce that. So that's what we could do in JavaScript. What we do in TypeScript, so this is just a really simple function I've created here. All it's doing is it takes a bit of text, right? And again, you'll see the same syntax where we use like a colon and then string to define it as a type when passing in a parameter. So this is a really simple function. All it does is it takes some text and it removes the full stops from that bit of text. So in this case, you wouldn't have to do this because it's pretty simple. TypeScript would actually work out what type you're returning, but it's good practice to always do it. So what you do is when you're writing a function is after your brackets where you pass in any parameters, you then do another colon, and then you do the return type. So this says remove full stops, right? It's a function, and it's going to take one parameter, some text, which is a string. So that's that bit here. And then this tells us it's going to return a string. Okay, so that's what that bit there is doing. And we could, if you're used to writing functions a different way, we could do it this way. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. So we could do it that way instead if you're used to using that kind of syntax for functions. But basically what we always do is we add that afterwards. And so that's our way of always telling us kind of here's what we're getting back from this function. I'll come on to like some more kind of complicated examples like slightly later on if we have time. So you might, because again, you might be looking at this and going, Joe, why are you showing us this? Obviously, this returns some text. This is all kind of just pointless extra work. When it gets really useful is when you start writing longer, larger functions. Maybe it returns, maybe you're using a union and it returns, like different possible types. It's just really helpful for you to see what it's doing. I think one, visually, you can kind of see straight away what this function returns. The other thing is if you're, let's say we define this function in this file and a whole other file where we're importing this function and using it, TypeScript will know straight away. So let's say I'm down here. So let's pretend I'm in a different file down here. And if I do my new text equals remove full stops. Hello. Then really helpful, like we can see straight away in our code editor what kind of like it will know what type of variable this is that we're getting back, and we can also like hover our mouse over it here, and VS Code will tell us kind of what we're getting back. So it tells us over here. So it's just again, I don't know how much sense it makes until you kind of get into actually doing some like really some more complicated examples, but it's yeah, it's definitely, it just kind of makes it helpful in a way that JavaScript doesn't. There's also, what did I also want to tell you? So if you remember when we were looking at unions just before, we could define like our own type. So maybe I'm going to define a type which is a town. So again, maybe when someone's filled in this form on my website, maybe they put in a string, maybe my code returns it as undefined. So there's two possibilities. We can then use that with our functions as well. So in this case, I've got a function, and maybe it's going to tell us, obviously, this is a kind of really super simple example. There'll be lots more stuff going on here. Maybe it talks to a database, maybe it does all sorts of things. And then at the end of it, we know what we're going to get back, which is going to be an array of towns. Okay, so we can see that after our colon, okay, we're going to tell us, right, our function returns an array of towns. Okay, super helpful. So it's just really useful. Yeah, it's kind of defining, okay, clearly what that does. That's another way of using it, using a type, a kind of custom defined type, using a union. Now, the next thing I want to show you is interfaces. I'm going to try and probably stop in 5 minutes or so to allow for questions. I want to show you all the other stuff first because it's all important and it's all fundamental. The bit where I find TypeScript most helpful on a daily basis is with interfaces, for sure, like far and away. So an interface in TypeScript, it's I don't find it the most helpful name, but anyway, it is what it is. An interface is a way, usually use it to describe an object. So let's say, for instance, I've got a really simple one here, an interface of volunteer. And we've got a name, and maybe we've got a skill, right? So you could in JavaScript, you could just have we could just do this with like a normal. We could just do this with a normal object. Where it starts to get really helpful is with interfaces. So we can, if we've got an object, yeah, we can find basically what properties we expect to be on that object. So we can have a name, which is a string. We can have a skill here, and that skill, oh look, there's that's got a capital letter, and I'm not used to saying skill. That's not, it's not a string or not a number. So that's a custom type that we can define. So we can say, right, okay, so each volunteer is kind of a skill, and then we're going to say, okay, it's from the set list. The other thing that I haven't put in here, but maybe we know their age. So one of the things we can do, so you see I put that question mark here next to age. So you can also do that, and that is to say, if we've got an object with properties where we don't know whether we'll have it or not. So maybe we've got some data about volunteers, and maybe we've got 10 volunteers, and we've got the age, maybe we know for half of them, maybe some of them we don't. So that will allow us to kind of know whether we have that or not. And then we can use those kind of functions. So like I've just written a really simple function here, which will take it'll take a team. So I've defined here, this is a team, so a team of volunteers. So sorry if I skipped it. Yeah. So this team, this is just a variable which is an array of volunteers. So there's one volunteer, there's a name and skill. Maybe tell you what, let's set Nadia's age, and then Mo, maybe we don't have an age for, let's have team 2. And we'll say Daniel, we're going to give him an age, but we're not going to give Rachel an age. So we can do that. And then we can then use that to basically, then when the thing that you find, the reason that I find interfaces useful is if you've got a project, if you've got something that's kind of where you're reusing like a data structure again and again. So here we've got like a volunteer, but that could be, maybe that's like a user. You might have users, and users have particular fields on them, perhaps. On the volunteer app that some of us are working on for the STA, we have things called projects. You know, a project is like, you know, helping a charity build their website. We reuse those same data structures again and again and again. What it means is you can define it in one place, and normally you wouldn't just have it all in the same file. You'd kind of have like an export statement, so you could use it in other files. And it's just a way of knowing again and again, we know exactly what data should be on that data type in a way that we can't do kind of easily in JavaScript. So it's just, yeah, that's when I find it kind of super helpful. So yeah, so that's a little bit on interfaces. I've got a couple more things I could show you, and also a couple more of the kind of headaches that you might run into in TypeScript. But I think I might stop there because we're at 1:45, and kind of open it up for questions. And then if folks don't have questions or we get through those, we've got a bit more time, and I could show you one or two more things. But yeah, I think I'll just see, is there anything that's on your mind? Is there anything you'd like to go back to? Is this helpful? Is there anything I've kind of skipped over that you'd like to know more about?
I'll scoot up and down for you, Joe, to see if anybody's got their hand up. Nobody at the moment.
Oh yeah, I see Alistair.
Very quick question. Can you do everything you want to do in VS Code?
Could you be a bit more specific? Do you mean kind of with,
instead of a different IDE, a JetBrains?
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. Sorry. That's a good question. I don't know. It's a short answer. I use VS Code, and kind of most people I come across do. Yeah. I would imagine, I mean, TypeScript, because it's so popular these days, if you're using another code editor, particularly if it's got some kind of extensions or kind of plugin functionality to allow, for different languages, then I would think it. I think it'd be very likely to support TypeScript. So yeah, good question. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
You've got a great introduction from Tim, by the way, on the chat, Joe, just so you know.
All right, cool. Thanks, Tim. Cool. Any more questions? Anyone like to ask? Would it be helpful? Shall I keep going? Show you a little bit more? Cool. Right. So we could dwell on this. I think I'm going to crack on and show you one or two more things. Generic objects. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this. This I included because what your best case scenario when you're dealing with data is to be, and with a kind of TypeScript approach, is to be really structured. Okay, so to kind of really know, okay, if I've got, say, a volunteer or a user, what fields are on there? Okay, which ones are optional? What type of thing are they? Kind of really thought through. There are cases where you're dealing with data. So this is I've changed the value slightly, but this is literally some data. So I was working with charities, and there's data coming from essentially their CRM, and it's just a list of kind of different. It's like different actions that someone could take on their website. So they might have like donated this year, so there's like a number, that's an amount. They signed a petition, it gives you a bit of text. There's something else, which is a number, and there are all sorts of things, and they're all just different. And so there are occasionally times you run into this where you want to avoid this if you can. If you're, it took me a while to kind of, yeah, it's not very obvious how to figure it out. Anyway, you can define a data type for a kind of generic object, basically, and it's got this kind of slightly weird syntax where you can set a key. So the key is like this thing over here on an object. That's your kind of name of your property, and then a colon, and then you can set your kind of value type over here. So yeah, so that's just, I'm just going to kind of leave that one there in case you want to kind of refer to it for reference afterwards. So that's kind of one thing. I'm going to look at a couple of other more complex examples. I've just seen in the chat, Tim was asking, can you learn TypeScript first without knowing JavaScript? It's a great question, Tim. I don't know is the short answer, because I've definitely come to it by doing kind of JavaScript first. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's the short answer. I think in some ways you'd find it easier to start with JavaScript because there's just kind of fewer constraints. You can just get using it, get a bit more comfortable with it, and then learn the extra things of TypeScript. But I don't know. That's a good one to Google for, I'd say. So yeah. Right, I kind of want to show you, do shout, because I'm not always looking at the chat, so shout if there are any more questions, feel free to interrupt me. Thought it might be useful just to touch briefly. So obviously I've been showing you some really simple examples, and you might look at something and go, oh, this is just so trivial, you know, why are we bothering? So this is from an actual project that I'm working on. It's a mapping project, and we talked to an API, and there's a link there if you want to kind of look at their docs, and you get back data like this. Look, it's filling a whole screen or more. Right, you get this really complex, and this is quite common, I think, if you're particularly if you're doing things like querying APIs, you're getting kind of this like nested data. So it's an object, there's nested data. Okay, it's got a few things, right? Then I've got some. This is basically, it gives you a journey. So you say point A to point B in a time, and it gives you a journey. But let's okay, so it's got roots, and it's giving me like an array. Within that array, I've got an object. Oh look, that root's got parts to it. It's got another object. And then there's some like times, there's a location. Okay, there's an array here. Okay, within that array is another array and another. Okay, so this is kind of complicated, right? It's complicated data. So if you imagine you have that data, you're getting it back from your API, and then you're writing some JavaScript. You're like, right, I just want to get the time of the departure from that journey. Right, where was it? Oh, right, okay. Okay, so maybe I'll go back and look at an example. Maybe I'll go and look at the docs. I'll try and kind of work it right. Maybe it was like, maybe it was, I'm just gonna do it this way. Just because if I don't do this, then VS Code will start telling me the answer. But like maybe it's like maybe was it like journeys, and then how was that spelled? Was it journeys or journey? Okay, journey. Let's say journeys. Was it an array? Oh, but then there was an object. Maybe it was the first thing there. And so you have to. Maybe I'll go back and check. Maybe I'll check the docs again. And I like this is the kind of pain that I've gone through again and again with JavaScript when you're getting more complex data, particularly when it's coming from outside. So literally in the code that I've written had to write to get this, I'm using Axios. If you use that and it queries an API, it gets back this data. What we can do in TypeScript, so in an ideal world, not in this case, you might be working with a library. So a lot of increasingly people like Google, possibly AWS, if you install their NPM, like their clients to kind of query their services, they will have put TypeScript into it. So it'll do this for you. But what I've had to do in this case, I've structured it. So this data, I've kind of created my TypeScript structures. What that means is when I use this again and again, I can actually, so it will tell me, oh, great, roots. Okay, what type of thing is roots? All right, okay, so that's an object. Okay, it's got root part. Okay, cool. So I can just do root part. And basically, it makes your life so much easier, essentially. And the same would be true if you've got other kind of particularly like complex data types. You can have nested ones. So within this interface, you can then use another interface or service. You can break it down. And normally you'd put these into separate files and then kind of export them so you can use them in different places. But yeah, that's just a kind of a real world example of it just makes your life easier, kind of makes everything so much more structured. And it's just harder to make mistakes. And I don't know if you found this as a developer, but it's so easy to just mistype things, forget if something's an array within an object, was it an object within an array, all of those things. It kind of helps on that front. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat, which I've just spotted.
I think there's one from Kat around useful training or online training, just to follow up on this.
Oh, yeah. Not that I've done, is the short answer. I think, have I? I'll check. Kat, I'll check afterwards. I might have done a Udemy course many moons ago. Yeah, so possibly. I'm sure there are loads. I'm sure they're great, even better than this.
No,
but yeah,
not true.
Not one specifically. So yeah, yeah. I don't know if there's anything else. George, you wanted a quick chat. Sure, maybe Slack me after this, George, probably easiest to kind of follow up. Tim was saying, find strongly typed languages like this weird. Yeah, I did find that too originally. So I've come into this more from like JavaScript, where it's kind of free and easy. Now I love it. I wouldn't go back. Now, anytime I can set up a project and choose how to set up, I would always do it in TypeScript. So I'm conscious we're kind of coming up to the hour. So I might kind of leave you with these, but I've got 3. I mean, there are many. You will run into more headaches than this, just to kind of be like totally upfront. I've left in here, we probably haven't got time to kind of go through these, but 3 common scenarios I've run into. A couple of them are to do with using npm packages. So, right, because we're not always in control of all our code, right? You're importing packages and you're then using it. What you'll find is some of them have good TypeScript support, some of them don't, but there are workarounds. So yeah, there's a couple of basically suggestions here. Sometimes you install an npm package and then like your coders will kind of have this angry red line, you get this weird message. Basically, that's if it kind of can't find the types that are being used in that package. So there's some tips here on how to deal with that, save you a bit of pain. And there's also a couple of tips here. So you will also find you have to, there are times when you have to kind of specify types things you don't know what they are because you didn't create them. Okay, so this is like an example of an event in React if you're using React. Often if you're using external packages within VS Code, like hover your mouse and it will kind of point you to places where they're defining their types, and you can kind of go and search for those within the code, within their kind of code package. So there's, I know I skipped those briefly, but just leave you with them. And then the other thing is, I suppose, you know, when you Google and you go on Stack Overflow and someone's got the answer to your problem, except they did it in JavaScript and it hasn't got all the nice TypeScript types you work, and you copy and paste it into your code and it doesn't work. So that can be a bit of a headache. Often just stick TypeScript as well on the end of your Google search, and you will find someone because increasingly more people are using it. You do have to spend a bit more time converting it to TypeScript. Yeah, I mentioned that well-supported code libraries, a lot of them increasingly integrate TypeScript. You can get away with it by just sticking the type as any or unknown. That's cheating. You'll get away with it for today, but you'll cause yourself pain tomorrow. Think of your future self and avoid the pain in the long run. Yeah, right, I'm going to stop there. I feel I've kind of rabbited away, particularly towards the end. I hope that was some help and was useful. I'd say get cracking, because it's with all these things, you've got to try it for yourself. And once you do, maybe you'll like it. And if you don't, you don't have to use it. But yeah, I definitely find it helpful, and hope today was helpful.
Brilliant. Lots of thanks and lots of recognition. That was really, really nicely done, really nicely paced. Thank you very much, Joe. And I think you've got a whole load of fans on GitHub now.
Great.
But thank you, everybody. Next week, we have the lovely Rosie, who's also here talking about JD Docs. So please join us. And then after that, one on GitHub and GitHub code spaces in particular. So I hope to see you all again.
Sounds good.